Islam was incredibly influential to Malcolm X's understanding of racism in the United States, and throughout his life, religion became and remained the single most important influence over his understanding of racism in the US. However, it was two very distinct, separate branches of Islam which were to be those primary influences. Finally, the ways in which Malcolm X understood racism in the United States changed significantly over time. Now, across Malcolm X's life, his views on a whole range of subjects changed. Seeing how Malcolm X's understanding of racism in the US changed is to examine his relationships with two very different branches of Islam. Marabou puts forward that Malcolm X reinvented himself throughout his life, and his religious views, or lack thereof, were central to those reinventions. Two branches of Islam were the overarching primary influences on Malcolm X's understanding of racism in the US. Sunni Islam and the Nation of Islam provided drastically different teachings which distinctly affected much more than just Malcolm X's understanding of racism. However, the teachings of these two branches often conflict extensively and mostly weren't held in unison. It was the fundamental principle of the nation's theology that black people are inherently righteous and white people were inherently evil, which is incompatible with traditional Islam, which maintains that people of every colour are welcome to join the Muslim Ummah. And the greatest distinction between the teachings of the Nation of Islam and Sunni Islam on race is that the Nation of Islam asserted that only black people were divine, whereas in Sunni Islam all humans were equal before God. Heavily influenced by Sunni Islam, Malcolm X would later reassess his views on racism and race, moving away from the black supremacist thought central to the Nation of Islam. While its followers undoubtedly see it as or the true form of Islam, the wider Islamic and scholarly communities often find themselves in opposition, arguing that the Nation of Islam is a heterodox concoction of pseudo-Islam, or heretical, at the very least a significant distortion. The nation's fundamental religious beliefs bear minimal resemblance to traditional Islamic theology, as while sharing a common vocabulary, the Nation of Islam's teachings concerning God, cosmology, Prophet Muhammad, and the afterlife can be considered heterodox or even heretical by Islamic standards. Through his introduction to the teachings of the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X informed himself with a deeper understanding of racism in the US, heavily influenced by the nation's doctrine. And by the early 1960s, the Nation had become a relatively well-known movement, with Malcolm X and his ministerial counterparts playing a significant role in promoting the Nation. The Nation advocated for the complete separation of black people from the white race, and it was through Malcolm X's adoption of their teachings that he found himself professionally acquainted with George Lincoln Rockwell, the leader of the American Nazi Party. The Nation's stances meant that they were amiable to the KKK and Rockwell's American Nazi Party, with Rockwell notably speaking at more than one of the Nation of Islam's rallies. Malcolm X welcomed media attention and opportunities for public speaking, in turn enhancing his prominence and reputation. Such was his popularity or notoriety that he was seen by many to be the figurehead of the Nation of Islam, with interview requests and invitations to speak at universities submitted to him rather than Elijah Muhammad. Popularity contributed to resentment and friction within the Nation of Islam, which may have contributed to X's disillusionment, departure, and consequently his openness to conversion to Sunni Islam. After Malcolm X left the Nation of Islam in 1964 and converted to Sunni Islam, he made a life-changing pilgrimage to Mecca. His Hajj reflected a point of continuation as well as a departure, with the pilgrimage serving as a catalyst for significant change in X's views. Malcolm X would prescribe Sunni Islam as a cure to racism, and it informed a new, broader understanding of racism in the United States, concerned with racism regardless of race. It was a departure from ethno-nationalist and black separatist thought as a means to combat racism in the US, with ideals of racial harmony replacing those of segregation. Perhaps the greatest impact of Sunni Islam on Malcolm X can be found in his own writing. Reflecting upon his pilgrimage to Mecca, Malcolm X recalled feeling companionship with fellow Muslims whose eyes were the bluest of blue, hair was the blondest of blonde, and skin was the whitest of white, a jarring departure from his previous rhetoric. X stated that he had been blessed with new insight, his racial ideology radically altered as he saw all races and colours in true brotherhood, living and worshipping as one. Malcolm X's departure from the Nation of Islam was a departure from racial separatism as a means to combat racism, and coupled with his embrace of Sunni Islam, represented a greatly changed Malcolm X. Whilst the teachings of both the Nation of Islam and Sunni Islam had significant influence over how Malcolm X understood racism in the United States, that isn't to say that there weren't other influences. Garveyism was a consistent influence on Malcolm X throughout his life, arguably the most prominent of other influences on his understanding of racism in the United States. Like Garvey, Malcolm X had been opposed to racial integration, and the black nationalism and racial separatism of Garveyism, combined with the teachings of the Nation of Islam, were very amiable to Malcolm X. In fact, the nation itself was arguably influenced by Garvey, with their teachings able to supplement Malcolm X's Nation of Islam influenced understanding of racism in the United States. The importance of Islam as a means to understanding racism in the United States differs depending on what point in Malcolm X's life is being looked at. The racial principles of the Nation of Islam and Sunni Islam were diametrically opposed, and consequently, they informed very different understandings of racism in the United States. A Nation of Islam influenced understanding sought the avoidance of racism through racial segregation or separation, and a Sunni Islam influenced understanding sought to avert racism through unity in shared Islamic faith. The Nation of Islam informed a narrow understanding of racism in the US, while Sunni Islam informed a much broader understanding. Furthermore, Malcolm X always viewed the opposition to racism in the United States as part of a wider freedom struggle, which was an idea that remained constant for Malcolm X regardless of what the primary influences over his understanding of racism in the United States were.